Hello and welcome to the Sci-Fi Christian. I am Bendy Bono here for part 2 of 4 in this video mini-series I'm calling Why Would You Watch That? Basic premise of it is looking at films that have a great deal of so-called objectionable content that Christians and others might be likely to toss aside as being worthless or wrong to watch, but yet I'm going to make the argument actually have a great deal to say to us, not in spite of their objectionable content, but because of it. If you want to know more about that, you can check out last week's introduction. Today we are talking about the first of the 3 films we're going to cover in this series, A Clockwork Orange. Now, before I go any further, 2 disclaimers that I think should be go without saying, but I'll go ahead and say them anyway. Number 1, of course, to cover these films we're going to have to get into all sorts of spoilers, so if for some reason you haven't seen A Clockwork Orange and would like to before you watch this video, you probably are best off stopping now until you've seen the movie. The second is that to discuss the content in these movies, I'm not going to pull punches on it. It's not my intention to be crass, but you know, this is graphic material, and we're going to discuss it in the detail that's required. So, if that bothers you, then likewise, you should probably go ahead and sign off now. Anyway, A Clockwork Orange. Well, it doesn't take a great imagination to understand why this is a great film for this series. If nothing else, it's certainly regarded as one of the most controversial films ever made, and if you've seen it, you know exactly why. Even if you haven't, before we get into the exact content of the film, just a little background on its history. It didn't take hardly any time at all after it came out in the mid to early 70s. Before it started to stir up problems all over the place. Not only was it condemned by numerous groups, religious and otherwise, but it actually, at Stanley Kubrick's request, wound up being pulled from distribution in England until after his death in 1999. The reason for that is that after the film premiered, he and his family started to get death threats by people who were upset about the content. And rather than put his family through that and put them at risk, he simply opted to have the film be undistributed in Britain. I can't say what ways there were or weren't around that, since obviously I A, didn't live in that time, and B, don't live in Britain. But despite that, of course, the film has gained an enormous reputation over the last 4 decades since it premiered. It at the time was blamed for different acts of violence that resulted, so so-called copycat killers that we hear about often with violent video games today. And just as it is today, the question of whether or not video games, or in this case a film, are responsible for the actions of the so-called copycat killers was a hotly disputed topic. Stanley Kubrick, of course, denied it vigorously, while various media groups and people who were opposed to the film and its content saw this as evidence of the fact that it should have never been made in the first place. So what is this movie then that stirs us all up? Well, I'm guessing most of you have seen it, but I'll recap just a few brief points for us. The film A Clockwork Orange follows our, I don't want to call him a hero, though he is our protagonist of sorts, Alex Delarge, who exists in a near-futuristic Britain. And he's a young man. In the book, he is 15 years old. He's aged up a little bit for the movie. Played by Malcolm McDowell in the movie. Played brilliantly by him, I should add. And he is part of a gang of droogs, as he calls them. There are various gangs of young men sort of marauding around the streets of Britain, doing all sorts of unconscionable activities. In the opening seconds of this film, we hear Alex discussing how he and his droogs are preparing for a night of, quote, ultra-violence, and he makes good on that promise throughout the next 30 or so minutes of the film, as we see he and his droogs not only beat and rob from people, but also rape and murder. And we see all this with a great deal of graphic depiction, I should say, on the screen. What happens then is that after all of this goes on for some time, Alex is arrested and he spends a couple of years in prison, at which point he is offered the opportunity for release if he undergoes an experimental drug program that will inhibit his ability to perform acts of violence, either physical or sexual, upon anyone. He undergoes a series of mind control experiments that essentially make him physically ill if he even so much as thinks of committing violence against others. And the story goes on from there to get into themes of free will and whatnot. So, as I said, all of that very graphically depicted in the film. There's, violence, nudity, sex, all the, kind of your big three right there. And it's no surprise that people watch this movie and are repulsed by it. In a sense, that is the reaction you're supposed to have, right? But I think that the point of this series then is to not just stop there, but to ask the deeper question. In other words, what then is the point of watching a movie like this, let alone making it? Well, first, an assumption or two. I think that maybe the basic assumption I would want to start with in discussing what's going on then behind this graphic and disturbing story is that, at least for me, we need to look at the people behind the film. When something like this is made, I think it's worth asking the question, who made it, and is this somebody who we trust to be thoughtful, or is this somebody who is just going to be putting sex and violence on the screen for sex and violence's sake? In this case, the film is made by the person who, in my opinion, is the greatest director of all time, Stanley Kubrick. Not only because of his cinematic abilities, but also because he's an incredibly thoughtful, was an incredibly thoughtful individual. And there's not a single one of his films that isn't thoughtful and full of great and interesting themes that are worth discussion and thought along the way. So let's then break down our analysis into two parts. First of all, I'm going to argue what some of those themes are, and then I want to answer the question of why does the film have to be so graphic in order to effectively grapple with those themes. Okay. So the first theme that we have is the one I will spend the least time on because it's the one that has gotten the most attention in scholarship and different writings about A Clockwork Orange, and that's the theme of free will, right? So one of the questions, and it's said directly in the film by a priest, actually, who he's a prison chaplain, he befriends Alex in jail, is that if you put Alex through these government trials, these medical trials that inhibit his ability to commit violence, you haven't actually cured him, you have made him something less than human. Why? Because you have taken away his ability to choose. You've taken away his free will, effectively. In other words, if somebody doesn't commit violence because they can't choose to commit violence, then maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's not. The film wants us to wrestle with that, but it's indisputable that that person has now become less than human, in a sense. And that's the purpose of the title, A Clockwork Orange, a biological entity, but that is ultimately just a machine that has no real choice behind the actions that it does. So free will is enormous, and one of the most fascinating points of discussion in the film. One of the things Stanley Kubrick wants us to think about with that is, okay, Alex is this horrible, evil individual, but yet are we okay with what happens to him in the film? Does freedom and free will require even someone like that to have the ability to choose? And the film definitely answers yes, but yet I think it also invites us to wrestle with that difficult question. The second theme that's coming out in A Clockwork Orange is the society's role in causing and preserving violence. Now, the causing part is very interesting as it comes out throughout the film. There is sexual imagery not only in the actions that Alex engages in, but just throughout the background of this film. Alex's world is a highly, highly sexualized world. And this is a very interesting idea that Kubrick comes back to a little bit, and one that I think would be controversial today, but controversial from a very different perspective. He comes back to this idea in Clockwork Orange, and then especially in Eyes Wide Shut, of the idea that what is the cost of living in a hypersexualized world? What is the cost of that in the case of Eyes Wide Shut on a marriage, on relationship? What happens when you start to go down that rabbit hole of free sex and no holds barred approach to sexuality that our culture offers? Eyes Wide Shut deals with that question in a more ambiguous way. Clockwork Orange, I think, deals with it in a way where we simply see the end result. Or maybe to back up, Eyes Wide Shut, maybe not so much ambiguous, but it deals with the process. Clockwork Orange deals with the end result, or at least a possible end result. That Alex is somebody who we see him simultaneously enjoy the work of Beethoven in the same way that he seems to enjoy rape and murder. He is unable to distinguish the morality of what he does. He has no moral compass. He is pure evil. And Kubrick doesn't want to deny his personal responsibility in that, but he also, in the film, wants us to question how do we as a society contribute to the factors where something like this can develop under our very noses, where it's not just Alex, but whole gangs of young men roving the streets, committing these heinous actions. How do we as a society contribute to that? And then on the flip side, what we see happen after Alex is given his treatment in the last act of the film is we see political parties from both sides attempting to co-opt what has been done to him, in order for their own personal gain. And so society winds up not only creating the conditions where an Alex DeLarge can thrive and do his horrible acts, but also the conditions in which those acts are preserved, because we wind up using people like that. We use tragedy for our own ends. And isn't that a theme that rings very true in today's world, especially with stuff that's been on the news recently? Anytime a tragic event occurs, it seems like you can check your watch and time it in about 30 seconds before both sides start to jump on and use said tragic event for their own political ends. The third theme, and this is one that I absolutely love, is that Kubrick is trying to get us to look at the potential for humanity. One of my favorite cuts, and I'm going to show it to you here in a second, or at least show you the images involved, in a Kubrick film, actually takes place between two films. It takes place between the end of 2001 and A Clockwork Orange. These films are back-to-back inside of his filmography. And at the end of 2001, what we see is the star child looking into the camera, and we see all the potential of what humanity can be and can become for good. And then we cut to the end credits. And then Clockwork Orange opens up with a fascinating parallel image, which is Alex's evil glare into the camera inside of the Korova milk bar. And we have the exact opposite of that image. We see humanity staring into the camera with all of the potential and everything that it could become for evil. And Kubrick's work is trying to get us to, whether or not that cut is intentional, he never commented on it one way or the other, but his work in both cases is trying to get us to see what humanity can be in both a good and evil way. In other words, if we want to watch a film like 2001 and feel the optimism for humanity, that's all well and good, but there's another side to that coin, and it comes out in A Clockwork Orange. And so in a very real sense, Kubrick wants us to see that there is an Alex inside of all of us, and that we as a species have the ability to go down that road, and that part of dealing with the human condition is recognizing that, dealing with that in a very realistic and profound way. That if we're not willing to deal with that, we're ultimately not being honest about what the human condition is and what it truly means to be human. All right, finally, and this is a big one, is Kubrick wants us to look at our own reactions to the film. Now, if you haven't seen the movie, and you're only hearing me describe what I've described so far, you probably think that Alex is an absolutely repulsive character. Actually, the exact opposite is true. He's intelligent, he's magnetic, he's well-spoken, he's a fascinating character. And what Kubrick does is he gets us to start to like him as a character. And so we are drawn to Alex while simultaneously being repulsed by him. And so Kubrick wants us to see our own reactions. What does that say about us? That even somebody this evil, somebody who we can be fascinated by, not only fascinated by, but genuinely enjoy watching. Alex is an enjoyable character. There's no two ways about it. That doesn't mean we enjoy what he does, but he's so magnetic and such a strong, charismatic personality that we can't help ourselves as an audience watching this film. And that's very much intentional, and that's something Kubrick wants us to wrestle with. More about that in the next section, which we will begin now. Which is why then, okay, those are our themes: free will, society's role in violence, potential of humanity, and our own reactions as individual viewers. So why does the film have to be so graphic in order to cover that? You know, one of the common objections to films like this is, couldn't you have just implied it? Couldn't you have just, maybe have the acts of violence or the rape take place off camera? Well, first of all, a lot of it does take place off camera. I think that's, that we have to be fair about that. But yet we certainly see a great deal of what is going on. And it certainly, the parts that we do see are very graphic. I think there's a few answers to this. The first one is that Alex's evil is vital to what's going on in the themes of this story. In other words, if the question, why does it have to be so graphic, is actually, why does, for Kubrick to explore these themes like free will, why did he have to make Alex so evil? Why couldn't he have just beat people up instead of raping them? Or, why couldn't he have just murdered them and we leave the sexual violence out? Why does he have to go that far? And Kubrick actually has an interesting answer to that. I'll let him speak in his own words. This is from a book I have of interviews he gave during his life, and this is an interview he was giving to the late Gene Siskel. And Siskel asks him pretty much that exact question. And he says, if Alex were a lesser villain, then you would dilute the point of the film. It would then be like one of those westerns where they purport to be doing a film which is against lynching, and so they lynch innocent people. The point of the film, meaning this hypothetical western, seems to be you shouldn't lynch people because you might lynch innocent people, rather than you shouldn't lynch anybody. Obviously, if Alex were a lesser villain, it would be very easy to reject his treatment, referring to the treatment in the film that takes away his ability to commit violence. But when you reject the treatment of even a character as wicked as Alex, the moral point is clear. In other words, Kubrick is saying that what he's trying to say about free will, if what happens to Alex happens to just a normal guy or a lesser villain, then it's very easy for us to react and say, yes, that's unjust. Of course his free will should be taken away. But if it happens to somebody as evil as Alex, then we really have to wrestle with that as viewers. Then the film statement becomes that much stronger. Okay? A second point is that films like this, it's very important that what somebody like Kubrick is trying to do is not simply to communicate to us the knowledge of what Alex has done, but to make us deal with that conflict of being repulsed and attracted to Alex in a very visceral, emotional, human way. In other words, if the only point is to hear Alex is a character who does this, this, and this, and then this happens to him, he loses his free will, and doesn't that present an interesting moral conflict for us, then there's no point in watching the film. I've just done for you the entire job of the film. But of course that's ridiculous, because no, hearing me talk about that, even if it does kind of, oh, yuck, that's disturbing, even if that's your reaction, it's not the same as actually watching the film. Why? Because the point of art isn't just to communicate knowledge of this, this, and this happens, but to make us feel it and respond to it in a real, visceral, and human way. And part of what Kubrick is saying there in that interview, and what he says elsewhere, is that no, No, we have to deal with this as it is in this extreme case. Kubrick's film is one that doesn't let us hit the eject button. It doesn't let us pull away. And if, to a certain extent, because of that conflict that we as viewers have of being attracted to Alex and repulsed by his action, if the camera was to only imply rather than show, the end result would be that we get off easy with our attraction to Alex. And that conflict is de facto resolved. Maybe not intellectually, because we still have to deal with the knowledge of what happened to Alex, but emotionally and viscerally it is. We no longer have that conflict at that point. Okay? Final point I'll make here about A Clockwork Orange and about why the film needs to be as graphic as it is. And that's to compare and contrast two villains. One, Alex, and then the second being a villain at least partially influenced by Alex, and that is the Joker in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. Now, of course, the Joker existed before Clockwork Orange, but in that particular case, Nolan did draw inspiration for his Joker from Stanley Kubrick's film. And it serves him well because they're, in some ways, very similar characters. They're characters who are... We do have that same conflict in a way with the Joker, right? Of being attracted to him and repulsed by what he does, but not in the same way, right? Our repulsion to the Joker is more abstract, right? It's more, yes, he does horrible things, he blows up hospitals and everything, he's evil, he wants to destroy all this stuff, but it becomes a more abstract view of evil. And I'm not saying that as a criticism, it works very well for what Christopher Nolan is doing, but the Joker in that film becomes the embodiment of evil as a concept, or he becomes a canvas for us to take evil acts and project them onto. And if you've read any, of the criticism about the film that deals with what is this saying about the war on terror, you very much see how the Joker becomes a parallel for modern-day terrorism. And so he becomes this more abstracted form, this archetypal, if you will, form of evil for us. And there's nothing wrong with that. It works very well. But what Stanley Kubrick is doing in A Clockwork Orange is very different. And he's not trying to deal with an archetypal evil. He's trying to deal with a fully realized character who is evil in this strong and visceral way. In other words, where it works in a movie like The Dark Knight to take a character like Alex and the Joker and abstract him, it doesn't work in A Clockwork Orange, because what Kubrick is trying to do is make it visceral for us. He's trying to make us deal with this in a concrete way, as a character who we get invested in as a fully realized individual. I mean, the Joker, by definition, and this is part of the brilliance of Nolan's film and what he does with that character, but by refusing to give us a background on that character, or giving us conflicting backgrounds as the Joker shares them throughout the film, he stops us from going down that route. And it's very brilliantly done. Kubrick's doing something different, and because of that, the actions of his villain need to be seen and felt and dealt with in a very different way than we have to deal with the violence and the horror inside of The Dark Knight. And yes, that requires what happens in A Clockwork Orange to be considerably more disturbing. Now, all that said, I'm sure there's plenty of people who disagree with me. Okay? I mean, we got disagreements on the last video. I'm sure there'll be people who disagree with this one. I'd like to just reiterate that the point of this series is not necessarily to get everybody to agree, but rather to get us to think, to spend some time and really consider, okay, maybe you think that this movie should have never been made, or maybe you don't ever want to watch it, but let's think about it. Let's think about the way that content like this does help bring about those themes. Let's take seriously the work of one of the great directors of all time, a serious and important artistic work. Let's not let ourselves off by cheap answers, no matter where you happen to come down on your opinions of the film. Alright? Okay, so that does it for week number 2 in Why Would You Watch That? Next week, we are going to be talking about Steve McQueen's Shame, starring Michael Fassbender, a fantastic film. If you haven't seen it and you're okay with some objectionable content, because of course all the films in this series have that, I'd recommend you go watch it before next week. Until then, though, I am Ben DiBono, and this is Sci-Fi Correction.